Imagine you step into a time machine, dial it back to 1989, and emerge in the Yugoslav Balkans. What do you see? Not the devastation you might expect. You see factories humming with activity. Assembly lines moving products across borders. Giant industrial complexes employing thousands. Sure, it's not Western Europe, but compared to much of the Eastern Bloc, this place is actually doing okay. Now fast forward to today. Those same factories? Empty shells. Windows shattered. Equipment long since sold for scrap. And the people who once worked there? They're gone. Not to another town. Not to another factory. They're in Germany. In Austria. In Switzerland. Living in countries they barely knew existed when they were young. Welcome to the Balkan economic paradox. A region sitting right next to the world's richest market, the European Union, that has received billions in reconstruction money, development programs and investment schemes. And yet it remains stuck in economic limbo, watching its best and brightest pack their bags every single year. Here's the part nobody wants to say out loud. The wars ended roughly 3 decades ago. You can't blame a bullet hole from 1995 for a bankruptcy in 2026. Something else happened after the peace deals were signed. An economic model that wasn't built for growth, but for extraction. This is the Balkan economic disaster explained. And it's worse than you think. Let's start at the beginning. The moment the Balkans truly lost its economic future wasn't during the war. It was in the boardrooms immediately after. The war destroyed the body. But the privatization? That destroyed the organs that were supposed to rebuild it. To understand how you rob an entire nation blind, you have to understand a weird concept from Yugoslavia called socially owned property. In communist Yugoslavia, factories didn't technically belong to the state. They didn't belong to private owners either. They belonged to society. Workers had usage rights and management control through worker councils. But nobody actually held clean legal ownership. This system was unique in the communist world, a middle path between Soviet state ownership and Western capitalism. So when the 2000s rolled around and everyone said, "Time for capitalism, let's sell everything," a massive legal black hole opened up. Who actually had the right to sell these factories? Who could sign the papers? The politicians answered, "We do." Here's the basic blueprint for how Balkan oligarchs were made. It wasn't about running companies. It wasn't about building businesses. It was about extracting assets. Let me walk you through it. Imagine a textile factory in Bosnia. Prime location. Hundreds of imported German machines. Skilled workforce. Real estate worth millions. On paper, this factory should be valued at substantial figures. But here's what happens. A politically connected auditor shows up. He ignores the land value, claims it's not relevant. Marks all the equipment as obsolete. Never mind that it's still functional. Suddenly, this multi-million-dollar enterprise is valued at a tiny fraction of its real worth. Maybe just hundreds of thousands instead of millions. The auction notice appears in an obscure publication. Maybe a local newspaper nobody reads. The deadline? Impossibly short. Only one buyer shows up to the auction. Coincidentally, that buyer is politically connected. Maybe a cousin of a minister. Maybe a businessman who donates heavily to the ruling party. Here's where it gets really clever. The buyer doesn't actually have the cash to purchase even this undervalued factory. So what happens? A politically influenced bank, perhaps one where the board members owe their positions to the ruling party, lends him the money. And get this, the collateral for the loan? The very factory being purchased. In a functioning financial system, this kind of connected lending would trigger criminal investigations. In the Balkans it was Tuesday. Now the new owner gets to work. But not on running the factory. On dismantling it. Workers are fired, hundreds, sometimes thousands of them. Equipment is sold for scrap metal. Warehouses are stripped for copper wiring and steel frames. The land gets rezoned from industrial to commercial or residential, then flipped to developers for massive profit. The productive economy disappears. The cash extraction remains. A tycoon is born. Hundreds of workers are finished. In parts of Bosnia and other former Yugoslav republics, governments tried something called voucher privatization. The idea sounded democratic. Give every citizen certificates representing tiny ownership stakes in former state companies. But here's the problem. Most people didn't understand financial markets. They'd spent their entire lives in a communist system. And they needed cash immediately to survive in a collapsed economy. So what happened? Informal brokers and investment funds started buying these vouchers cheaply on the street. A voucher worth potentially thousands? Sold for the equivalent of a few hundred. These buyers consolidated control of entire companies, and then stripped them just like the insider buyers did. People sold decades of national wealth for grocery money. Let me paint you a picture. There's a factory worker in Kragujevac, Serbia. He built cars for decades. In the late 1980s he was solidly middle class. He could afford a modest apartment, annual vacations, and had hope for his children's future. By the mid-2000s his factory was gone. His severance? Maybe a few €1,000 total. And nobody wanted to hire a middle-aged industrial worker in a collapsed manufacturing economy. So he joins the shadow economy. Drives an unregistered taxi. Guards empty buildings. Works construction jobs paid in cash. And he watches political elites, the same people who orchestrated the privatization, drive luxury cars past unfinished homes and shuttered factories. A generation learned a brutal lesson: hard work doesn't pay. Connections do. That's how you permanently damage a society's trust and fairness. When economists talk about the Balkans, they obsess over GDP growth rates and unemployment figures. They're looking at the wrong numbers. The only number that really matters? The census count. Because the region is experiencing a demographic collapse so severe that some experts describe it as silent depopulation. Not by bullets but by bus tickets, work visas and one-way airline tickets. Let's look at the shocking numbers. Since the fall of communism, Bulgaria has lost roughly 2 million people. That's about 25% of its population. Not from war. From emigration. Bosnia might be the most tragic case. Nearly as many Bosnians now live abroad as live inside the country itself. Think about that. Entire towns exist mainly as WhatsApp groups and Facebook communities scattered across Germany, Austria, Sweden, and the United States. In Serbia, the population shrinks by tens of thousands every year. That's roughly equivalent to a medium-sized town quietly disappearing from the map annually. And this isn't just happening in remote villages. It's hollowing out entire regions. According to recent research, Albania has lost 37% of its population in the last 3 decades. North Macedonia lost 10%. Serbia lost 9%. Bosnia lost 24%. But here's the truly damaging part. It's not just about how many people are leaving. It's about who is leaving. The Balkans has accidentally created a pipeline that subsidizes the healthcare systems of wealthy European countries. It costs a country like Serbia or North Macedonia tens, sometimes hundreds, of thousands of euros in taxpayer money to educate a doctor from childhood through medical school. That money comes from VAT paid by pensioners buying bread and families scraping by on modest salaries. The state invests everything in these students. And then, the moment the diploma is printed, many graduates take a German language exam and leave. Germany gets a fully trained doctor. The Balkans gets nothing. It's a massive invisible transfer of human capital from poorer societies to wealthier ones. One of the largest quiet wealth transfers in modern Europe. According to projections, Serbia alone will lose around $9 billion as a direct result of brain drain in the science, technology, and innovation sectors. This creates a strange cultural phenomenon. Visit a rural village in eastern Serbia, Kosovo, or Bosnia in July, and it looks like Monaco. Luxury SUVs, Swiss license plates, oversized villas with marble gates and elaborate fountains. These are the gastarbeiters, guest workers coming home for summer vacation. But here's the dark twist. Nobody actually lives in these houses. For 11 months of the year the shutters are closed. The villages are silent. Gardens grow wild. Entire neighborhoods exist as empty monuments to departure. And the people who stayed behind internalize a brutal message. If you stayed, you failed. That psychological pressure destroys the idea of building a future locally. The population decline has become so sensitive that governments are sometimes afraid to count their own people. North Macedonia avoided holding a census for nearly 20 years because ethnic population ratios affect political power and constitutional rules. In Bosnia, census results are politically radioactive because they influence representation, funding, and institutional control. Everyone quietly fears the same thing, that the countries they're fighting over are slowly becoming empty shells. In the West, you might join a political party because you agree with their tax policy or healthcare vision. In the Balkans, for many people, you join a political party so you don't starve. This is the clientelist trap, and it's the single biggest engine of corruption in the region. Let me explain how this machine works in practice. Political parties divide neighborhoods into microzones. A local party captain becomes responsible for a specific street or even a single apartment block. He knows exactly who lives where. He knows their son needs an internship. He knows the grandmother in 4B has been waiting months for surgery approval. He knows whose business license is stuck in bureaucracy. He knocks on the door. "We can help," he says. "But we need your support." And support doesn't just mean voting. In the worst documented cases, it means photographing your ballot as proof of loyalty, being bussed hundreds of kilometers to wave flags at party rallies, making phone calls to pressure other voters. In exchange, you get crumbs. A temporary municipal contract. Fast-tracked paperwork. Food packages during campaign season. There's a term across the region, senvikari, sandwich eaters. It refers to busloads of people transported to political rallies, often compensated with a sandwich, water, and transport. It sounds almost funny. But many are low-income workers pressured by employers or party bosses who genuinely fear losing their jobs if they don't show up. This system requires a constant supply of jobs to distribute as political rewards. So the public sector expands endlessly. Bosnia is the extreme example. The country operates with a 3-member rotating presidency, roughly a dozen governments and parliaments across different layers, well over 100 ministers and thousands of deputies, assistants and agency heads. Each institution becomes a political fiefdom. If one party controls the national telecoms company, they fill it with their supporters. If another controls forestry services, they fill it with nephews and cousins. Merit becomes irrelevant. Loyalty is everything. According to recent analysis, the Serbian Progressive Party claims to have about 750,000 members, and membership in ruling parties is seen as an opportunity for employment and advancement. So how does the party finance this machine? Public procurement. Here's how it works. A city announces a €1 million road project. In a healthy system, multiple companies compete with fair bids. In a captured system, the tender is written so narrowly that only one company can possibly qualify. Must have exactly 14 trucks, 2 painted yellow, and 10 years of prior experience on this specific street type. Miraculously, the mayor's brother-in-law owns that company. He wins the contract for €1 million. He then subcontracts the actual work for €400,000 to workers who do the job. The remaining €600,000? It circulates through kickbacks, party financing, and loyalty payments. It's a closed loop. Public money funds political power, which protects the system that siphons public money. And if you refuse to participate? Inspections suddenly become very interested in your business paperwork. Your licenses get delayed. Your permits get lost. Walk through Vračar in Belgrade or the upscale neighborhoods of Tirana, and you'll notice something bizarre. Construction cranes everywhere. Luxury towers rising like mushrooms after rain. Penthouses selling for €500,000 or more. Now look at the official data. Average salaries hover around €700 to €900 per month. Mortgage rates are relatively high. The population is shrinking or stagnating. By textbook economics, housing prices should be cooling. Instead, in parts of Belgrade, prices per square meter have jumped roughly 30 to 40% over just a few years. So who is actually buying these apartments? That's the question that leads us to the fourth pillar of the Balkan crisis, the laundering economy. The Western Balkans sits on one of Europe's main drug transit corridors. Organized crime networks based in Serbia, Montenegro, Albania, and neighboring states play a major role in moving cocaine from South America into Western Europe. That trade generates enormous volumes of dirty cash, hundreds of millions, potentially billions of euros across networks. You can't walk into a bank and deposit 10 million in unexplained cash without triggering alarms. But you can pour concrete. A simplified version of the cycle looks like this. 1. The investor, a shell company appears, often registered offshore or through layered ownership, represented locally by a law firm. 2. The capital injection, construction is financed through opaque channels. Inflated invoices. Related party subcontractors. Partial cash payments. Weak oversight allows illicit funds to blend into legal flows. 3. The buyers' apartments are sold to cash buyers or other shell entities. Mortgages are often absent. Ownership transparency is minimal. 4. The clean asset. The property now carries a legal deed. When it's resold later, taxes are paid and the money appears legitimate. Regional watchdogs and international organizations have repeatedly flagged construction and real estate as major laundering vectors in the Western Balkans. The most visible symbol of this system is Belgrade Waterfront, a multi-billion euro redevelopment backed by UA-linked investors, transforming old rail yards into a Dubai-style skyline. To enable it, Serbia passed a special law overriding existing planning and property regulations. The darkest moment came on the night of April 24 to 25, 2016. Masked men arrived with excavators in the Savamala district. They detained civilians, confiscated phones, illegally demolished buildings. Citizens called the police. The police did not respond. Later investigations confirmed that emergency services had been instructed not to intervene. In a European capital city, an entire block was destroyed while institutions stood down. It exposed where real power actually lived, not in parliament but in the networks controlling the cranes. This laundering economy distorts everything. Governments point to construction cranes and declare growth. But for teachers, nurses and young families, rents surge out of reach. Ownership becomes a fantasy. Adults remain living with their parents into their late 30s. Cities hollow socially even as skylines grow taller. It's a city built for people who don't live there, funded by money that shouldn't exist. Now let's address the elephant in the room. These countries desperately want to join the European Union. They receive billions in EU funding. Why doesn't the EU stop this corruption? The uncomfortable answer? The EU often tolerates it. Political scientists call this system stabilitocracy, a model where authoritarian-leaning governments are tolerated because they deliver geopolitical stability. For roughly 2 decades, the relationship between Western governments and Balkan strongmen has operated on a quiet transaction. The West effectively signals, we won't press too hard on media capture, patronage networks, or questionable elections. In exchange, you deliver 2 things. 1. No war. Keep ethnic tensions under control. Don't destabilize the region. 2. No migrant surges. Act as a buffer zone for refugee flows moving toward the EU. As long as stability is preserved, democratic backsliding is often tolerated in practice. Slovenia joined the EU in 2004. Croatia joined in 2013. Since then, enlargement momentum has largely stalled. North Macedonia offers the clearest example of this frustration. After changing its constitutional name to resolve a dispute with Greece, a huge concession, accession negotiations were still delayed. First by France. Then by Bulgaria over language and historical issues. For many citizens, the message became brutally simple. No matter what reforms we make, membership remains distant. Why sacrifice for an EU that keeps moving the goalposts? Balkan leaders have learned to exploit this hesitation. When criticized by Brussels, they casually mention Moscow or Beijing. They sign infrastructure deals with China. Purchase equipment from non-EU partners. Highlight alternative partnerships. The message becomes implicit leverage. If you pressure us too hard, we have other friends waiting. If you listen to government press releases, foreign investment is booming. Major European manufacturers are coming. Big factories. Thousands of jobs promised. But the bigger question isn't who is coming. It's what kind of investment is actually arriving. The Western Balkans has quietly branded itself as the cheap labor workshop of Europe. The pitch to investors is brutally simple. Come here. Wages are low. Workers are desperate. Regulations are flexible. And we'll pay you to hire people. Here's how it typically works. A foreign manufacturer, maybe an automotive supplier or cable producer, approaches a Balkan government. We're considering opening a factory in your town. The government responds, we'll give you free land. We'll build the access road. We'll fast-track all permits. And we'll subsidize each job. In practice, these subsidies often range between 5,000 and 15,000 euros per worker hired. Now do the math. If a worker earns 400 to 500 euros per month, a 10,000 euro subsidy offsets a large portion of that worker's wages for the first 1 to 2 years. The investor's risk is minimal. The public absorbs the cost. The worker remains on minimum wage. This model produces mostly low-skill assembly work. These workers aren't designing engines or writing software. They're assembling components someone else designed. Copper arrives from Germany. Plastic arrives from Asia. Workers twist, crimp, and package. The finished product goes back to Western Europe. The value stays abroad. The wages stay local and low. The Italian shoe manufacturer Geox opened a large factory in Serbia with heavy government subsidies. Jobs were created. Politicians celebrated. When the subsidy period expired, Geox shut down operations. More than 1,000 workers, mostly women, lost their jobs almost overnight. The investor exited. The town absorbed the economic shock. This isn't industrial development. This is subsidized labor arbitrage with an exit strategy built in from day one. When the EU started asking too many annoying questions about environmental standards, labor rights, and corruption, Balkan leaders found a new partner. one with deep pockets and a policy of don't ask, don't tell. That partner was China. Beijing sees the Balkans as a backdoor into Europe, strategically located and hungry for investment. For Balkan leaders, China looked like an ATM with no strings attached. The poster child for this disaster is the Bar-Bolgar Highway in Montenegro, sometimes called the Highway to Nowhere. Montenegro, a tiny country with a GDP barely above $5 billion, took on one of the largest infrastructure loans in its history to build a road through some of the toughest mountains in Europe. A project Western banks had long deemed too expensive and economically unviable. In 2014, Montenegro signed a $944 million loan from China's Export-Import Bank to fund the first 41 kilometers of the highway. That loan ended up becoming more than a quarter of Montenegro's total external debt. Only a short section has been completed. The remaining 120-plus kilometers remain unfunded and economically questionable. Some analysts describe the project as having saddled the country with debt Montenegro struggles to manage without outside help. This isn't just a budget story. It's an environmental one too. The highway passes through sensitive natural terrain, including the UNESCO-protected Tara River Gorge. Local activists have reported significant ecological disruption. Debris left along riverbanks, sediment flushing into waterways, fish populations declining. Early investigations into environmental damage were dismissed or stalled. It's a classic developing world trade-off. Sure, we'll build your infrastructure, but the environmental and fiscal costs will be paid by your grandchildren. We've described a nightmare. Corruption, theft, pollution, brain drain. So the logical question is, why aren't there riots? Why isn't Parliament burning? The answer lies in two safety valves that keep social pressure high, but just below the threshold of a full political crisis. Official statistics can be misleading. If unemployment were truly 30 to 35% in formal terms and people had no income, they'd literally be unable to feed their families. But they aren't starving. Why? Because a huge share of the economy exists off the books. The taxi driver who never registers his business. The plumber who gets paid in cash. The hairdresser who works evenings without receipts. These workers aren't captured in official payrolls, but they are surviving. Studies by the World Bank and regional research institutes consistently show large informal sectors in the Western Balkans, sometimes 20 to 40% or more of total economic activity, depending on how it's measured. This vast informal zone creates a buffer. It supports a culture of snaise, figure it out on your own. You don't rely on the state. You hustle. It buys the system time and breathing room. This is the most important graph nobody ever shows you. In Kosovo, Bosnia and Herzegovina, North Macedonia, and Albania, remittances from abroad account for a significant share of GDP, often between 8% and 15%, and historically even higher in some years. That's money sent home by workers in Germany, Switzerland, Austria, Norway. It's cash that pays the rent, buys groceries, keeps the heating running. Without these inflows, household consumption would collapse. Local economies would face acute contraction. Here's the dark genius of the system. For a corrupt political class, emigration is often a feature, not a bug. Who tends to leave? The young, the educated, the ambitious, the angry. These same groups fuel protests and political change elsewhere. When they leave, they take their grievances and organizing potential with them. Who stays behind? Older voters. More risk-averse citizens. People tied to state or party networks. By exporting their discontent, these economies inadvertently preserve the political status quo. It's a cynical, unintended perpetual motion machine. Youth leave, they send money back, families survive, political pressure diffuses, the old order persists. No revolution. Just quiet departure. So to answer the question in the title, why did the Balkan economic mess never truly heal? Because the people tasked with treating the patient learned how to profit from keeping it permanently sick. The transition from socialism didn't evolve into a healthy free market. In many places, it hardened into what political scientists call a captured state, where political power, business interests, public contracts, courts, media, and employment pipelines all serve the same narrow elite. Factories were privatized into friendly hands. Public institutions became hiring halls for loyal voters. Regulation became selective. Independent competition became risky. The system rewarded connections over competence. Meanwhile, the most talented and ambitious people quietly exited, not because anyone forced them out, but because the local system offered too few pathways for fair advancement. To sustain growth and political stability, Governments increasingly leaned on foreign capital, foreign loans, remittances, and geopolitical balancing acts, deepening long-term dependency rather than building resilient domestic economies. The result? A region stuck in permanent limbo, always reforming, always negotiating, always transitioning, never quite arriving. According to the latest World Bank projections, economic growth in the Western Balkans is projected to slow to 3% in 2025, from 3.6% in 2024. The recovery remains fragile, vulnerable to external shocks, and insufficient to reverse demographic decline. Recent analysis shows that corruption and informality continue to undermine fair competition and deter potential investors, with perceptions of corruption worsening in some economies. Yes, there is hope, but it's probably not coming from the political class. It's coming from people who quietly refuse to play the old game. The programmer in a garage in Niš or Tuzla who works remotely for global clients and bypasses local patronage entirely. The investigative journalists who expose corruption despite pressure and threats. The environmental activists blocking rivers to stop illegal mini-hydro projects. The civic groups fighting for transparency, rule of law, and accountable institutions. The system is deeply rigged, but cracks are forming. Young people are building businesses that don't depend on political connections. Digital workers are earning Western salaries while living in Balkan cities. Civil society is getting bolder. The real question isn't whether change is possible. It's whether enough people will stay and build it, or whether they'll simply pack a suitcase and build their future somewhere else. Because that's the ultimate tragedy of the Balkan economic disaster. The region isn't failing because it lacks talent, resources, or potential. It's failing because for 3 decades, the system has been designed to extract rather than create. To enrich the few rather than develop the many. Until that changes, the exodus will continue. The factories will remain empty. And the Balkans will remain Europe's forever transition, always almost there but never quite arriving. This was a heavy one. If you're from the Balkans, let me know in the comments. Did I get it right? Did I miss anything crucial? Or do you think I'm spreading misconceptions? If you found this valuable, please subscribe and share it with someone who needs to understand what's really happening in this region. Because these aren't just statistics. These are real people, real communities, and real futures being shaped by decisions made decades ago, and continuing today. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.